The year is 2025, we're living in the future, and yet graphics cards are still being sold with just 8GB of VRAM. Which isn't very generous, is it? Let's jump into the surprisingly weird, wonderful, and confusing world of VRAM amounts. I was going to go through each and every amount of VRAM and when it came into existence and when it was eventually phased out again, but it was incredibly dull and actually very difficult to make. A terrible combination for a YouTuber such as myself. So here are some graphs that I made when I was trying to do that, but be warned, it could be slightly off because the more you investigate this topic, the more weird variants of cards you discover with utterly mental specs. But to keep it simple, most of these record-breaking cards, which were the first or last to have a certain amount of VRAM, you wouldn't care about, nor would you ever want to own, for reasons which will soon become apparent in this video. So let's keep the topics simple. When did 8GB of VRAM become a thing? It was 11 long years ago in 2014, and a year after the card's initial release, when AMD's Radeon 290X graphics card started selling in an 8GB variant. 8GB! The very first time a normal card had ever had that much VRAM. An insane amount for the time, given that other high-end cards like Nvidia's GeForce 980 had just 4, and even the almighty Titan card had just 6. And I thought it was pointless for the 290X to have 8GB of VRAM, because it felt like overkill. Because back then, it was a very different world. More VRAM was typically used as a marketing trick to fool tech-unsavvy buyers into buying it over a faster card with less VRAM. Thing is, this was back in a time when a graphics card's performance typically became the bottleneck long before its VRAM amounts did. But things have flipped in the years since, and now it's typically the VRAM that falters long before the rest of the card becomes obsolete. Fast forward to 2025 and the latest cards to be released from AMD and Nvidia still both contain 8GB variants. And that's despite increasing concern and evidence that this is no longer enough to handle today's games, let alone tomorrow's. As always, this topic is a lot more nuanced than it first seems, because 8GB is still enough to adequately run most games today. It's probably adequate for most people, especially those on 1080p monitors. But it's perhaps time that these sorts of cards are only sold in the budget market, and by that I mean quite a bit below the current $300 asking prices. Because with the 60 tier of cards being sold now, having 8GB of VRAM is beginning to limit their usefulness long before their time. New cards like the GeForce 5060 and Radeon 9060 are actually very capable, especially with support for increasingly powerful upscaling and frame-gen technologies. If anything, it's as though these tools are too powerful and risk making these $300 cards appealing enough for most people to want to buy, instead of to opt for more expensive ones instead. So it's almost as though limiting VRAM amounts is the current way of incentivizing upsells by artificially shortening the cheaper card's useful lifespans. But I hate the idea of e-waste. It also seems deceptive, as releasing cheaper 8GB models is seen as a way to give the illusion of value, whilst shortchanging unknowledgeable buyers and forcing those in the know to be upsold to a more expensive 16GB variant of the same card. But change is in the air, and I have a sneaking suspicion that the next generation of 60 tier cards at least won't be stuck with 8GB of VRAM. They'll probably come with 12. Speaking of which, what's with these weird VRAM amounts? Okay, 12GB of VRAM is still quite understandable, but back in the day it was even simpler. If a certain amount of VRAM wasn't enough, then they'd simply double it the next generation to the next power of 2. 64MB no longer enough? Up it to 128. Hell, make it 256, just to be safe, and so on. But for whatever reason, manufacturers started using strange amounts. I suppose back in the day, progress was so rapid and prices dropped so quickly that companies could justify doubling stuff whenever the previous standard was no longer enough. But more recently, perhaps as a cost-saving measure or for built-in obsolescence, they'd rather opt for fractional increases to the amount of VRAM and to the memory bandwidth on their cards. And it's because of this that we've started to see weirder, harder to explain amounts of VRAM that at first glance don't seem to make that much sense. I remember the GeForce 8800 series coming out with 640MB and 768MB of VRAM and all that nonsense. All these numbers are still fairly easy to understand. 768 is halfway between 512MB and 1GB. 640MB is halfway between 768 and 512. 320 is half of 640, and so on. But it marked a change from the simple powers of 2 and the bountiful excess VRAM of yore. The GeForce 580 came with an unusual 1.5GB of VRAM, and that looks awkward because it's got a decimal place in it. And then 3GB was the next big milestone that cards enjoyed fixating on for a while, all the way from AMD's high-end 7970 series to Nvidia's cut-down GeForce 1060 variant a few years later. The next standard after 8GB. While 16GB would look to be the next logical step, and one I'd be very happy with, I suspect the next generation of budget cards will instead opt for 12. And then we can expect that annoying situation where budget cards can either have 12GB, which is a little bit too little, or 24GB, which is too much, unlikely more than the cards in the tiers above them have. So yeah, although 12 will likely be the next minimum spec, the gap between 8 and 16GB of VRAM has already been explored quite thoroughly by previous generations of cards, typically in the high-end market. First with the 11GB 1080 Ti and 2080 Ti, and then the 10GB 3080 a few years after that. Shout out to AMD, who until recently were quite generous with their high-end cards, giving their 6800 series 16GB and the 7900 series 20GB or more, until the GRE, which only had 16. And also well done to Intel, who right now are also being quite generous with their VRAM amounts. Their current budget cards contain 10 and 12GB of VRAM, which I'm fine with, because for their price points this is rather generous, and it finally shifts the minimum up and away from the 8GB seen elsewhere. And while the current push for 16GB to become the new standard is a welcome step in the right direction, like I said, for AMD it's actually a step down from their previous gen 20 and 24GB cards, whilst still offering similar performance. At this point I'm surprised that 14GB cards have never been a thing. Interesting trends. I noticed some curious things. When cards doubled their VRAM amounts, it wasn't usually long before they doubled them again. For example, in 2010, 2GB was the most VRAM you could get. Then in 2011, AMD released their first 3GB card, and also their first 4GB card, and also their first 6GB one as well. Okay, maybe it didn't quite double again, but in the minimum spec, AMD discontinued their last 256 and 512MB cards in the same year, and their 2 and 4GB cards in the same year. Now I know this is probably down to the memory chips available at the time, or the company moving to a new graphics architecture with a different memory configuration, but that's the problem with tracking the first and last cards like this. It doesn't really tell the big meaty story of what's going on in the middle, which is where most people's experiences lie. But it does show us that, despite AMD being known for being more generous with their VRAM than Nvidia is, when you compare the minimum VRAM amounts, the two companies always seem neck and neck. Meaning that if one company decides to kill, say, 8GB cards, then it might not be long before the other company follows suit as well. Although with the latest releases, it seems like neither company is that willing to do that just yet. But the silver lining is that progress comes in infrequent but major leaps. So rather than seeing the stagnation of 8GB cards all over the place as being a symptom of slowdown that will continue into the future, I like to think that we could be right on the cusp of the next shift up. For this video, I didn't even bother investigating mobile and pro graphics cards, which would come with all manner of weird VRAM amounts by themselves. But don't worry, it's already confusing enough. For example, the confusion of the first 4GB card. In Nvidia's lineup, the first 4GB card is probably the GeForce 980, being the first card they made with a baseline amount of 4GB. Cards before this one came in 2 and 4GB variants, where the 4GB variant was typically quite uncommon. So if you really wanted to go back further, then the first 4GB card from Nvidia would probably be in 2012 from some uncommon variant of the GeForce 680 or the ultra low-end 640, both of which had 4GB variants, which were seldom found and even harder to put a price on. The same was sort of true with their 700 series, and even in 2014, while the GeForce 970 technically had 4GB of VRAM, to be even more technical it had 3.5 plus 0.5 GB of VRAM. Thus, the GeForce 980 was Nvidia's first proper 4GB card. By which point a proper 6GB card in the form of the Titan had been out for a year already. AMD's 4GB story is just as confusing. Welcome to the Radeon 6570. A supposed $80 card from 2011, yet there are so many different and super elusive variants of it that I don't know what to think of it anymore. It came in 1 and 2GB variants, which is already as much VRAM as the high-end cards from that time had, but according to Tech Power Up, companies such as PCS and Sapphire released special 4GB models. Total overkill on a card of this caliber. But then maybe it's a fake 4GB, because Sapphire also released a hypermemory version of the 6570. And that means it instead just uses some of your system RAM, which is cheating if you ask me, because then there's no limit to how much VRAM it could technically have. So again, if we argue a card isn't a proper 4GB card until it has 4GB at a minimum, then it would be the R9 290 series from 2013, which came with 4GB, and in later rare 8GB versions as well. In other words, the world's first proper 4GB card also happened to be the first 8GB card. Nvidia's freak graphics card equivalent would be the GT440, a card from 2010, but also 2011, that came with 256 megabytes, 512 megabytes, 1 gigabyte, 1.5 gigabytes, 2 gigabytes, and also a 3 gigabyte model, all featuring various types of DDR and GDDR RAM. But yeah, it was possible to get a GT440 with 12 times more RAM than another GT440. And although the card's MSRP was just $100, the 3GB model was only OEM, so they'd have only come from pre-built rigs, meaning that you wouldn't be able to buy one and slot it into your PC. Yet here's one for you to buy and to slot into your own PC. I want to get off Wild Bones' VRAM ride. What even counts as a new graphics card? Can a GT705 be deemed its own card, or is it merely a re-release of the GeForce 520, which was itself an ultra low-end card from 3 years prior? Or how about the GT710, a 2014 card that came out again in 2016 after most of the next generation of cards had been released, making the GT710 the card that sports the dubious honour of possibly being Nvidia's last 512MB and 1GB card ever to be released. Ugh. There is very little information about some cards online, especially those that are last to offer yesteryear's amounts of VRAM, likely because they are just rebrands of previous graphics cards. And what little information about them there is online often contradicts the other very limited sources I could find, or worse still, the statements stood alone with very little evidence to back up what was being said. As an example of this, the GeForce 945A, which is so questionable that I'm not even sure what sort of form factor it's intended to be used in anyway. In fact, I began to question whether it even existed at all. So let's move closer to present day and ask, what was the 4GB card of all time? By this point, hopefully we've established that the last card to offer a certain amount of VRAM is not typically a very good card. And the last 4GB cards to be sold happen to be the Radeon 6400 and 6500 XT cards, which firstly were intended to be mobile chips, and secondly weren't even as good as the previous generation cards they were there to replace. But the crypto boom was a very weird time, so I like to give them a bit of a pass. In fact, I rather like them, but that's another story. So let's change the question a bit. What was the fastest 4GB card ever to be made? Well, it depends on the game being played, but the honour probably goes to the Fury X, a Radeon card from way back in 2015. And even then, it was criticised for having just 4GB of VRAM, namely because it was up against the 980 Ti, which had 6. Granted, it had 4GB of very fast HBM memory, and it was released 7 years before AMD released its final 4GB card. But even then, it was still criticised for not having enough. Makes you think, doesn't it? Which moves us on to the conclusion of this video. So if you've gathered anything from this video, it turns out that VRAM is a very big, complicated matter. The first card to have a certain amount of VRAM tends not to have the power needed to justify it, while the last card to be released doesn't have enough VRAM to justify its level of power. So there's a balancing act to be struck, typically a few years after we see a certain amount of VRAM hit the market. So following that logic, you wouldn't want to get the latest 8GB cards, as they likely are towards the tail end of 8GB lifespan. I think Intel's push to beyond 8GB sets a precedent, especially now that the internet has become so vocal about their dislike for 8GB cards in what's meant to be enthusiast graphics cards. No doubt we'll see future 50-tier products popping up in later years to keep the 8GB nightmare alive, and mobile variants of future generations will likely drag on for years with just 8GB as well. And then some weird Chinese graphics card in 5 years' time will also have 8GB for some reason. But I'll give all those cards a pass, so long as they're priced below $200.